Okay, so now we're going to do the punctuation chapter in my book, Overcoming ACT English, which can also be used to practice for the SAT as well, to review like the grammar skills before moving on to doing practice tests to practice with those specific question types. So let's start with period equals semicolon equals comma fanboys. So basically, it's like a little formula that you can remember that if a period works, a semicolon works. If a period works, a comma fanboys also works. What do I mean by fanboys? Well, I mean these words: for, and, whoops, that's supposed to be and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Oh my gosh, that was terrible. So those are the words. So like a comma plus a comma and then one of those words together are the same thing as a period. So if you can use a period, you can use a semicolon, you can use a comma fanboys word. Another way to say that is if we're connecting two independent clauses, two things that could be their own sentence, we can use either a period, a semicolon, or a comma fanboys word. Just like in these examples right over here. So if you look at the bottom, let's start with that one. Here I have a comma plus a fanboys word, comma, and then my fanboys word but. So to check if that's correct, I say, hey, can I replace that with a period? Would that work? Because if that works, then a comma fanboys also works. So let's see. Tokyo is a bustling metropolis. That could be its own sentence. Let's check if the part that follows could be its own sentence. It also has tranquil gardens. That could also be its own sentence. So a period works, so comma fanboys works. And there's similar logic between all the other examples where if a period works here, which it does, you could say Tokyo's bustling metropolis, period, and then you could say it is home to cutting-edge technology, period. So a period works there, so a comma fanboys or a semicolon could also work there. So that is that. Technically, there's a rule that says that you can use semicolons to separate a list of long phrases, but that it might have shown up one time. I can't even recall a time that it has shown up on the exam. So I would just ignore that because it's probably just going to confuse you, and the likelihood of it showing up on the exam is like minimal. So let's keep on going. So other ways to use commas. So you can use them around interruptions, which you can also think of as non-essential phrases. So if a quick trick that you can use is, well, you can memorize this formula for the punctuation that goes around the non-essential clause. But basically, think of the name, non-essential. It's not essential to the sentence. It's kind of like extra information usually that you can cross out because it's not essential and still have a complete sentence. So if you can cross it out, most of the time, when you cross it out, if you can still have a complete coherent sentence that makes sense, it means that that is a non-essential phrase, so it should be surrounded by either parentheses, em dashes, or commas on each side. Now, make sure you only pick one of these. So you can only pick, like, I'm going to do only parentheses, or I'm going to do only em dashes around the non-essential clause, or I'm going to do only, commas around the non-essential clause. You cannot mix and match. Like, you can't say, oh, I'm going to use a comma and then a parentheses around my non-essential clause. No, you can't do that. But you also can't say that you're going to double up. You can't say, oh, I'm going to use both. I'm going to use parentheses and commas because that's just redundant. You don't want to do that. So you basically just pick one. It can be this, or this that you're surrounding them with. As long as you only pick and stick to one, you are good to go. Let's see. There's an exception that could be tested. Oh yeah. Sometimes they like to put them around transition words. You kind of saw that in the transition chapter before, an example of that. And like, it's not very common, but I just wanted to mention that. Usually it's going to be around a non-essential clause. So I would just focus on that. So what I was saying, it's not essential. So it's like the extra interrupting information usually that you can cross out and still have a complete sentence. So usually to check these, like if you see something is surrounded by commas as an option, cross out the part in between the commas or in between the em dashes if it has the em dash version, or between the parentheses and see if you still have a complete sentence. If you do, then then that's a non-essential clause, and it should be surrounded by either a pair of commas, a pair of em dashes, or a pair of parentheses. So if we cross that out, it reads as a complete sentence. That makes sense. Olivia Smith is the youngest person to ever win the school spelling bee. In this example, a 6-year-old girl is a non-essential clause, and we crossed it out and it still made a complete sentence. So this, I would say, is like one of the most helpful tips on the exam because they love testing this. Not even like just testing this, but you can eliminate a lot of answer choices with this. Where like if you see in the answer choices, they'll include like the commas around it, or the em dashes around it, or the punctuation around, or the parentheses around what they say is a non-essential clause, and then it might not be a non-essential clause, and you'll see that when you cross out the information. So then you'll be like, oh, it definitely can't be that answer. So it can help with process of elimination as well. So I would definitely get used to like anytime you see an option where there's like parentheses around something, em dashes around something, or commas around something, crossing out that information in between to see if it works. So here are some other examples. You could also say the annual dance, which was coordinated by the Parent-Teacher Association, is the most popular and elaborate school dance. Here, you could cross out this portion. That's the non-essential clause, and you could read it as a complete sentence. The annual dance is the most popular and elaborate school event. So it works. Here, you could cross out the word words for instance, and it would still be a complete sentence. Alexandra excels in mathematics but struggles in history. Similarly, over here, you could cross out this and it would still read as a complete sentence. So it's correct. The artist's new exhibit features modern sculptures which are made entirely of recycled materials. So, and we already went over the wrong examples. You can't mix and match and you can't double up, basically. Now, another way that you'll see commas, they might test it like maybe once or something, is with lists, to separate 3 or more items in a list. Now, when I say list, I don't mean like it has to be tangible items. Like a list could be like sort of like things that you can't grab a hold of, like learning, exploring, and problem solving. Like that's still a list of things. It's just not like something that you can hold, like a tangible item. So when I say items, it could be like tangible or like abstract sort of items. So let's look at this example. Sam believes that adults can rediscover their passion for learning, exploring, and problem solving if they are given the proper encouragement and resources. So here we need to separate our items in our list with commas. Now, you might notice I said both of these are correct, and the only difference between them is right here, where you can have a comma in front of the and, or you cannot have a comma in front of the and. Technically, those are both correct. It's like, I forget which one is used more in like Britain and one of them's used more in America. But basically, like when we were like determining the rules of grammar in the English language, like British people decided that like they were going to prefer one version, and then we decided we were going to prefer another. So they're both technically correct. So they're not going to ever test you on like having to decide between those two. So just know that if you see 3 or more items in a list separated by commas, that right before the last item in the list, you have the option to put a comma or to not put a comma. It's both of those are correct. But the other items in the list need to have the commas. So like learning is the first item in the list. So after the first item in the list, you put a comma, and after the second item in the list here, you would decide if you wanted to or not, or like on the test, they would decide, I guess, if they wanted to or not. So yeah, that's an example right there. They're both technically correct. So we also have a comma can go between 2 adjectives if the word and works in between them. So I'll show you an example of what I mean. So you could say it was a dark and gloomy day last Friday. And works, so a comma works. So and that was a terrible and. Oh my God. That's a little better. Okay, so if the word and works between the adjectives, then you could put a comma there. And it doesn't matter, like it doesn't have to be in alphabetical order or anything. Like it could be in either order. You could say it was a gloomy and dark day last Friday. That works. It was a gloomy and dark day last Friday, like with the word and, that works. So you could put a comma in between those because the word and works. Now, where this would not work and where you don't want to do this is when the first adjective is supposed to modify the second adjective. Like with this example, it says she wore a deep blue dress that captured everyone's attention. Deep is supposed to be modifying or describing the word blue. So that's an instance of when you can't put a comma in there, because you can't say like she wore a deep and blue dress. Like you're not describing the dress as deep. It's like the color blue is deep. So it wouldn't be appropriate to say she wore a deep and blue dress. Instead, it would just be deep comma blue dress, because deep is describing blue. When you're looking at like dark and gloomy, dark is not describing the word gloomy. Dark and gloomy are both describing the word day. So that's why you can use an and there, but not here. And then, so the correct version would be like not to put a comma there. So she wore a deep blue dress with no comma that captured everyone's attention. You can kind of hear it a little. I hate like using the word here because you really shouldn't hear, like, get used to like justifying it with like a specific rule. But if you're like stuck, like that's an example of when you could kind of hear it. Like we don't say she wore a deep and blue dress, like the deep doesn't apply to dress. Like you can kind of hear that one a little bit. Okay, so let's go to introductory words and phrases. So this one is kind of like what follows here. Like this is kind of the same as this one, dependent clause, comma, independent clause. So for the purposes of this exam, think of a dependent clause as something that cannot be its own sentence, and think of an independent clause as something that is a sentence or can be its own sentence. So if you have a dependent clause and an independent clause, you need to always connect them with a comma. And the way that they love to do this on the exam, which is why I made it like a separate thing, even though it falls under this category, is they love doing this with like introductory words or phrases. Like in the correct examples right here, it says, after sleeping for over 8 hours, Elena felt well rested. So it's like introducing this part. The dependent clause is the introductory phrase that's introducing the independent clause, Elena felt well rested. It's just like a lot of times it'll be like at the beginning to introduce like whatever is coming next as the independent clause or as the what could be a complete sentence afterwards. So after sleeping for over 8 hours, that couldn't be its own sentence. That's dependent. And then Elena felt well rested. That's independent. That could be all by itself, independent. It's kind of in the word. Like you could think dependent depends on other stuff to be a sentence, and independent is just all by itself. It could be its own sentence. It's independent. And when we connect those, we have to have a comma in between. So here we have an example that says Snow White is usually a romantic story. However, the new movie does not include a romantic plot line. So here we have the word however is an introductory word, not necessarily a phrase, followed by a complete sentence. Or what could be a complete sentence, the new movie does not include a romantic plot line. So in a way you can say dependent, comma, independent. That's why I like to use the, even though you have like all these different like clauses, like relative clauses, a positive, like all this stuff and mumbo jumbo, you don't need to like think about all of that. You can literally just think, for the purposes of this exam, dependent, not a sentence, can't be a sentence. Independent can be its own sentence if we wanted it to. And that's it. So all about simplifying stuff. So that's basically what this rule says, dependent, comma, independent. And then here's a couple more examples. Because I studied, that would be dependent. That can't be its own sentence. So then we have to have a comma. And then the independent clause, I did well on my test, could be its own sentence. Here we have, since studying bi-weekly with a tutor, that's going to be dependent. That can't be its own sentence. You're waiting for them to like finish the thought. Like, what do you mean? Since studying bi-weekly with a tutor, you can't just end there. That's not a sentence. So it has to be followed by a comma and then an independent clause. Marisol has improved her grades. When Marisol began working with a tutor, that's a dependent clause, can't be its own sentence, so then we need comma. And then her parents did not expect her grades to improve significantly, so it would be an independent clause afterwards. Now, you might see an example of the reverse situation occurring where you have an independent clause and then followed by a comma and then a dependent clause. Now, the reason I'm cautioning you saying like this, like I say it's rare, but it's not really rare. It's like, it's just rare in comparison to the independent, or dependent comma independent one. But you will see this on the exam. It's just that you have to be careful of like not using this as like an 100% rule. Look out for the specific ways that we see independent comma dependent, because sometimes it'll trick you. So like the ways that you'll see independent comma dependent is when the dependent part, this part, is a verbing example, meaning like it has a verb in the ing format following the comma, or when you have relative clauses, which are like the WH word clauses, sort of is like how you can think about it, like words like which follow the comma, followed by like the phrase that it's talking about. And then we have names and titles example. This one's more rare. Like it's probably that you're going to see this one and this one. But names and title could be like another example where like you have a comma, then a name or a title. So like here it says the elaborate cake was made by Anthony's brother. Like what's his name or title? It's Alan. So like it has to be a comma before the name or title, which would be the dependent clause. So like these are the ways that you're going to see the dependent clauses show up when it's independent comma dependent. Now, if you're like cramming right now, you might just want to think like every time you see an independent comma dependent and every time you see a dependent comma independent, like or if like you're not trying to get like a super high score, I've seen students like use just the dependent comma independent or independent comma dependent, like just as that rule, and get like in the 1400s and stuff. So like but it's just like it depends on like test day also of like how they're gonna like what kind of questions you get and stuff like that. So it has worked with students in the past where like they've just used that. But they can trick you on a couple of questions. So if like you're okay with losing a couple points, maybe just based off of that rule, if you want to just use like the generalized version to get a decent score, then you can do that too. It just like, it kind of depends on your needs, if that makes sense. Now, I also include a section that's like ways not to use commas, but like, again, like you want to simplify your life for these exams. Like you're not going to remember everything. And I know I say like a lot, sorry guys. But you're not going to remember a bunch of different strategies. So it's kind of redundant to like say, here's ways that we definitely use commas, but here's the ways we don't. Cause like technically we could list forever the ways that we would not use commas. You're better off just thinking about the ways that you should use them and then just like justifying if like you put a comma there, like here's the reason why, because of one of the previous comma rules that we discussed. But just in case, I put like some common ways that they might try to trick you where they like to put commas when like they're not supposed to be there. So we don't use a comma before or after a prepositional phrase, before a preposition, unless the preposition is the beginning of a non-essential clause. Never use a comma before or after that. That one is one that they like to do a lot. That one I would say is one of the important ones to remember. Never use a comma before or after that. Never use a comma before parentheses. That one's not really tested that much. Do not use a comma around self words unless there's a reason a comma needs to be based on one of the previous comma rules that we were mentioned. Like this is what I'm saying. Like it's like you would have to justify it with one of the previous rules usually. So like you would know based off of that whether or not you would put the comma for an example like this. And then let's see, it says our new dish. Oh, it's just giving two different examples. So like I can justify the project myself, comma, but it's going to be difficult. Here we have a comma fanboys. So like we can put a comma fanboys because it's two independent clauses that we're separating, two things that could be its own sentence. A period could go there in place of this. A period would work. We could say I can finish the project myself, period. and then we could follow it with it's going to be difficult, period. And I forgot to put a period there. Oopsies. So we could say, hey, that is an example of our previous rule coming through, so we need to put a comma there. But it would be wrong in this example to say our new dishwasher, which costs more than our car, loads itself after each meal. There's no reason for you to have a comma right here with the self word. So there's no other justification. We don't have something like a comma fanboys or something like that where we're connecting to independent clauses or any of our other previous comma rules. So it would be inappropriate to put a comma there around that self word itself. Okay, so now I would go and try attempting the punctuation quizzes on your own, punctuation quizzes 1 through 3. I'm not going to do them right now. I'm going to do a separate video with all the punctuation quizzes together because I want to go over like all the notes and get those videos out before I get like that, because there's a lot of punctuation quizzes, so I want to like get the notes out and stuff. And me reviewing the examples and kind of teaching you before I do the video, like a bunch of quiz videos. So like I'm gonna postpone and put this in like a separate video of me doing like all the punctuation quizzes for this chapter together in one video. So we're gonna go now all the way to the apostrophes portion. So basically like pause here, do the examples, and then like watch the video that I put up after this to see for punctuation quizzes 1 to 3, anything that you need clarification on, and then unpause it to come right now to the apostrophes when you're done with that. Okay, so for the apostrophes stuff, basically you're gonna see this mostly for like showing possession, to indicate possession in nouns or like ownership of like whatever the noun is that follows. So and I'll tell you some other ways that you might see this, but for right now, we're going to focus on the possession part. So it's important to remember that the noun that is indicating possession or ownership is the important part when determining singular versus plural. So for instance, if we say, let's go to this example right here, that if we're trying to say that the multiple toys belong to the one dog, it's dog, like the dog that is like owning or possessing, like the thing that owns or possesses what follows it. That's the important part for determining singular or plural when we're saying all these rules about like if it's singular, do this, if it's plural, do this. Here, we're trying to say that it's just one dog owning multiple toys. So this dog part is singular. So if we have the word that's indicating possession or ownership being singular, what we do is we add an apostrophe and then an S to it. So like dog, we just add an apostrophe S to it, and that shows that that one dog owns the multiple toys. So first you need to ask yourself like, hey, am I showing possession? Because that's when I would use an apostrophe. So here are some examples where it would not be appropriate to use an apostrophe because you're not showing possession. So if you were saying more than one boy is playing, saying the boys are playing, just because there's an S doesn't mean you put an apostrophe, because it's not saying that the boys are playing. Like it's not owning what follows. The goddesses are beautiful. You're just saying there's more than one goddess is beautiful. It's not saying the goddesses are beautiful. Like there's no ownership there. It's not owning what follows it. So you would not need to do an apostrophe. So you ask yourself, the step for these is like, is it possessive? If no, then don't add an apostrophe. If yes, then you have to move on to step 2. Is it singular or plural? So for the example that we showed right here, we said, okay, the thing that's showing ownership or the thing that's owning or possessing what follows, the dog, that's singular. We're talking about one dog in this case. So that means if it's singular, I add an apostrophe S. And this is another example, the car's engine. We're talking about one car, the engine of that one car. So the car, the engine belongs to that car. The car is showing the ownership of the engine. So it's singular, showing ownership of what follows. So we have to add apostrophe S. And I know cars can't own things. Like when I say ownership or like possession, like you kind of have to take that like with a grain of salt, like not take it too literally, but you get what I mean. It's basically like it belongs to it. Like it's a part of it, it belongs to it in some way, even though a car doesn't have belongings, like we know, but you get what I mean. Like it's the engine of the car, like that the car possesses. So then we have another example of here we're talking about the wheels of the bus, like multiple wheels for just one bus. Now, the thing that's owning or showing ownership is the one bus. It's singular, so we have to add apostrophe s. A lot of people get confused with this because they think that if it ends in s, you always just put a regular apostrophe. That's false. You have to think it's not like it ending in s that determines things. Is it singular or plural that helps you determine, that you need to think about first to help you determine whether what kind of like apostrophe you're doing or like where you're putting the apostrophe. So if it's singular, even if it ends in s, it's still just apostrophe s. Like that rule never changes. If it's singular, add apostrophe s. Where it gets a little tricky for people is there's two different plural things. So if it's plural, if the noun showing possession is meant to be plural, like let's show in this example right here. If we're talking about one toy belonging to multiple dogs, it would be dogs plural because we're talking about multiple dogs. So if it's a plural noun that already ends in an s when you make it plural, then because multiple dogs, like when we say dogs, more than one dog is dogs, it already ends in an s. Then you add an apostrophe after the s. So if it's plural and ending in, and the plural ends in s, you put an apostrophe after. Same thing here where you're talking about the engine of multiple cars. It would be cars, like many cars that you're talking about. So you need to put an apostrophe after the s. This is also one that like a lot of people get confused about. Something like dresses where it's like es at the end. You still just use the regular plural form. Like in any sentence, how would you spell dresses? You would spell it the normal way, D-R-E-S-S-E-S. So the normal plural version is dresses. You're talking about multiple dresses. So it's already ending with an S when it's plural, just put an apostrophe after the S. So if it's plural and it ends in S already, when it's plural, then just put an apostrophe after. Now, there will be some cases where you have nouns that are irregular, like children, where if we say the children went to the playground, children would be plural. And if we're saying like it's a playground where the children play, or the playground like that belongs to the children, like the children's playground, here children, even though it's talking about multiple children in its plural format, children is the plural, like children already means multiple, like there's multiple kids there. That's already the plural. When it's plural, if it does not end in S, because when it's plural it ends in N here, you add apostrophe S. Same thing here. If we're talking about the conference for women, or like that belongs to the women, like it would be the women's conference, we would just add an apostrophe S because women, when it's plural, doesn't end in S, so you add apostrophe S. So basically when the word is singular that shows ownership, or plural but not ending in S, those are the cases where you add an apostrophe S. If it's plural, if that word is plural, that's indicating ownership, and it already ends in an S in its plural format, that's when you just add an apostrophe after the S. So here I put some like common irregular words that you might want to be familiar with besides the examples I already gave, if you want to memorize those. Another way that you might see this show up is with common contractions. So like contractions are like abbreviations kind of, where if we don't want to say the whole word, like do not, we shorten it, and like where we shorten it and take letters out, that's where the apostrophe goes. Like do not becomes don't. You're probably not going to see those outside of the format that I'm about to show you with like specific examples below. So you don't have to worry about, that's why I'm like, there's all these books and stuff where they like list every single contraction, and it's not every single contraction because there's like a bazillion out there, and you're always going to miss one. So it doesn't make sense because they could pick anything. for you to memorize every single contraction, what does make sense is to say, okay, I'm going to memorize the ones that like might show up on the exam or that are very likely to show up on the exam, which I'm going to go over with you now. So here, rare contractions, this one's rare, so I wouldn't put too much like effort into these examples, but just in case. So you can use an apostrophe S to indicate that you're abbreviating for is or has. So like, for example, you could say, the officers arrested the suspect. The officer has arrested the suspect. That's what that means. I should have just highlighted this part. Officers means officer has. Here it says the books available in several stores. This means book is, like they've just abbreviated it. So it could be abbreviated, an abbreviation for like is or has. Now, again, that's rare. You're probably not going to see that on the exam. And when I say it's rare, you're probably not going to see that. Like you might see it on the exam. Like that's not me saying it's not going to show up ever. I'm just saying like most people aren't striving for a perfect score. So like out of like everything I say is rare, you might have like 2 questions on it or something. And then like, are you really going to like waste hours and hours of energy on like 2 questions that you could study every single like possible word for? Maybe if you can find all of them. I don't know. Nothing's impossible, but like, are you going to spend all that time like on all those different things when you could just perfect the other stuff? And then like the 58 other questions that you have to do, like just perfect that and get those right. Like that seems like a better use of your time to me. So then let's go to, these are going to be the more common ones. So it's versus it's, like the 2 different versions. So this kind of goes against what I was previously saying in a way. These are kind of like irregular ways that we use apostrophes is how you can think about it with like these specific words that go together. So with these specific examples, the contraction is the one with the apostrophe is the contraction. We're not using apostrophes to indicate possession with these irregular words is how you can think about it. So this one, it's with the apostrophe S means it is or it has. So if in the sentence it is or it has works, then that means that it's with the apostrophe S is the correct version. So all you have to do is basically substitute in it is or it has. And if that works, it's the apostrophe S one. So like when I read this, I'll read it as Antarctica is cold. As a matter of fact, it is one of the coldest places on Earth. It is works there. So it is works. So I use apostrophe S. Now the one without the apostrophe is actually the possessive one in this case. So you see how it's kind of like irregular from what we were talking about before. You just kind of have to memorize these. So for this one, basically, it's is owning or possessing whatever follows it. I find that the way that's more helpful for students to understand this is to just memorize the contraction ones and like use those words in the sentence. And if it doesn't work, then like go for the other default option. So like for instance here, I would try starting out saying it is, seeing if that works, it has, seeing if that works. If those don't work, then it has to be the possessive version. So like I would say Antarctica is a continent famous for it is icy landscapes. That doesn't work. Antarctica is a continent famous for it has like icy landscapes. That doesn't work either. So it has to be the possessive one. Because, and then if you want to talk about like the possessive justifying it, you could say it's because the Antarctica is like owning the icy landscapes. Like it's icy landscapes. But again, I think it's like way easier to do the contraction thing for a lot of people. So let's now go to using the different yours. So again, the contraction one is the one with the apostrophe, the shortened one, abbreviated version one. I'm sorry if this keeps on unfocusing. I'm trying to make it focus. Okay. So here, you are works. If you are works when you read it, then it's the apostrophe RE one. So here you could say, if you don't stop eating that cake, then you are going to have a stomach ache. You are works, so you use the apostrophe one. But if you try to use you are in this sentence, if you read it as you are father, is very proud of his achievements, you couldn't say you are there. That doesn't work, so you have to use the other one, the one without the apostrophe, to indicate possession. So basically, if you just memorize your two options and you just like substitute in the you are or the it is or it has, you can pretty easily figure out which one it's supposed to be. It's just make sure you remember these are your only options. These are the only way that you could spell it's with an S, and this is the only way that you could say any form of your. There's no other options available. So like if you see something where it's like it's with an apostrophe after the S, that does not exist. That is not real. That is fake. So these are your only options. So let's now go to the different theirs. So again, I would memorize the contraction one to start with. There with an apostrophe RE just is the contraction for they are. So if you can say they are, then you use this one. And here's an example of when it works. The Amazon rainforest and the Sahara Desert are both unique ecosystems, and they are often studied by well-known scientists. They are works, so use the apostrophe RE one. So that's how I would go about that. I would check that one first, because it's usually the easiest to check. And then if that doesn't work, then I would go for the possessive one. And I would say, does it own what follows? Like in this example, the Amazon rainforest and the Sahara Desert are remarkable for their contrasting environments. Like those contrasting environments belong to the Amazon rainforest and Sahara Desert. Those places, they own, in a way, the contrasting environments. They own what follows the word there, so you have to use the I one, possessive, the possessive format, because they possess those contrasting environments. So I would basically memorize those two, and then if those two options don't work, then it's this one, the regular THERE option. The reason I say like don't memorize, like, because there's so many ways that you could use there. Like there's places, there's like you could say over there, you could say like there is a test tomorrow, and that's not talking about a place. Like there's different ways to use there. And it's a lot easier to just think like, oh, each of these ways there's only one option, and then if that doesn't work, then this is the default. Like use this option of there. So like for instance, how that would work here is I would first try they are. So I'm going to read this with they are. Let me erase this. So I would say various types of animals live in the Amazon rainforest. In fact, thousands of species live they are. Doesn't work, so it can't be the they are version. Now I'm going to try possessive. I'm going to see, does it own what follows? Well, there's nothing following it, so it can't possess or own whatever follows it. So it definitely can't be possessive, so then it has to be my default option. Now let's look at this one right here. There are many reasons that I do not want to celebrate my birthday. Let's try they are. They are many reasons? No, not gonna be that one. Now let's try possessive. Does there own what follows? Does it own are? No. So it can't be possessive, so then it has to be our default. So now let's talk about the two different whos. So again, the one with the apostrophe is the contraction. So it means who is or who has. So in this example, Alan Turing, is a mathematician who is most famous for his contributions to computer science. So who is works, so that means you have to use the apostrophe one. And then kind of think about it like how we've been talking about the other ones. If the contraction doesn't work, then it's the possessive, usually. So because like we have the there one where there's three different options, but the ones where there are only two options and one of them's a contraction, just like if the contraction doesn't work, it's the other one. So here we could say, okay, I'm going to try who is there and who has to see if it works. Alan Turing is a mathematician who is complex and unprecedented discoveries have helped develop modern computing. No. Alan Turing is a mathematician who has complex and unprecedented discoveries have helped develop modern computing. No. So it would be who's possessive, because it's like his complex, like unprecedented discoveries, like it's the ones that he owns. He's owning them, possessing them, so it has to be the possessive whose. So that's the different whos. Now, this is also pretty rare, but and because it's rare because people usually know this just from like the beginning of like first grade and stuff, we start seeing this of like he is, she is, like we are, like where they shorten it with those contractions. So they're not going to give you something that easy, which is why these are rare, but just in case I put them here. So he's with an apostrophe S means he is or he has. The possessive version would be his. Like you could say that is his baseball bat. Like his is showing possession of the baseball bat. It like is the possessive for the baseball bat because it's his baseball bat. And then similarly, like she is or she has is the apostrophe S version. Her or hers would be possessive. Were, like we are, and then ours would be the possessive. So those types of things. And here's some examples if you wanted to see those. Again, like these are probably like, these are not like, if anything, like the way that they would do this is usually with like the possessive, and they might say like his instead of her. And like the previous sentence was specifying that we were supposed to be talking about a female or something. And they're going to do that so that it's like kind of like the pronoun matching thing where it has to match in gender and number of people. And they'll give you options like her, his, them, they, like those types of things. And you have to match gender and like singularity, like if it's singular or plural. If anything, that's how you'll see like the her and his stuff usually. I mean, they can show up the other way, but it like usually there's another way that it gets eliminated, or like how you figure out the answer is something other than like, oh, we're indicating possession. So let's go, and again, I'm going to do the apostrophes quiz as part of that separate video. So if you want to pause this really quick and then go do that, and then watch the video later to go over anything that you might have missed, I would do that. And then after, unpause it, and then come back to this video right now to go over colons and dashes, which we're going to go over now. So colons, basically, here's the important part. When you're talking about this stuff with the colons, it has to be that there's an independent clause first. That's one of the ways that they like to trick you on these. So it has to be before the two dots, before the colon, because that's what the colon is, in case you can't see it very well. It's like the two dots that are on top of each other. That's a colon. Before, it has to be independent. There has to be an independent clause. It does not matter what follows if it's dependent or independent. You can have either one. Like whatever goes here doesn't matter. It could be independent or dependent. The important part is this guy always needs to be capable of being its own sentence. That has to always be independent. And then what follows, it matters more in terms of content than like what kind of clause it is. So what follows would have to be either like a list or an explanation or like clarification of something, or, and this is more rare, a quote. You're usually going to see these guys right here. So here's some examples. So like, here's a list example. There are 3 things you need to bring to the camping trip, and then it lists those 3 things: a tent, a sleeping bag, and bug spray. So we have an independent clause that could be its own sentence, and then it's followed by a list. And then now we say she knew what her weakness was, and then it explains it after the colon. She couldn't resist chocolate. He faced a difficult decision, continue working at a job he hated, or pursue his dream with no safety net. So that's like a further explanation of what it was talking about in the previous independent clause. The secret to happiness is simple. Live in the moment. Again, it's like clarifying, explaining further after the after the colon that follows the independent clause. And then we have the CEO made his philosophy clear. And then it gives like a quote of like specifically what the CEO says. Again, like that's more rare. You're probably gonna see these 2. The other 2, like the list or the explanation clarification one. Now you can also use it a dash there. So like it would be correct in that first example to put a colon there. It would also be correct to put a dash before you put the list of items. And the same thing with the explanation ones. Like you could put a colon or you could put a dash. Those are both equivalent. They're both the same. So I blacked out this part because I realize now doing the video that like this is kind of like what the example I used in the previous version is kind of like a controversial rule of like whether or not you use commas to like separate like contradicting element sort of things, and it's not tested on the SAT or ACT. So I was like, that was kind of stupid of me to put that as an example right there, because it would just confuse students further. So I decided to change the example that shows this rule right here by adding on to this sentence right here, which says, she knew what her weakness was. She couldn't resist chocolate, but she needed to eat healthy. So like this is an example of where you could use like a colon and a comma, or you could use like a dash here would also be acceptable, and a comma. Sometimes you can use those in the same sentence. It just can't surround a non-essential clause. So like when I was saying the like you can't mix and match thing, that was when we're talking about a non-essential clause. Here, this is not a non-essential clause. We can't just get rid of that and the sentence makes sense. So here we would be using, instead of surrounding a non-essential clause with commas and em dashes, we have a different justification for using an em dash and for using a comma. The justification here for the dash would be, hey, we have an independent clause, she knew what her weakness was, followed by an explanation of that weakness, she couldn't resist chocolate. And then here we're using a comma because it's a comma fanboys. We could use a period there to separate these two independent clauses. She couldn't resist chocolate. It could be a period, and then we could say she needed to eat healthy. So that's an example of like how you, just because you see like a comma and a dash in a sentence doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. There just could be a different justification behind it besides like commas surrounding a non-essential clause. Like there's other reasons to have commas, there's other reasons to have em dashes. It's just that you can't mix and match if you're trying to surround a non-essential clause, which we are not doing here. And so another way that you can use a dash is a pause. So here, again, like sometimes I put these little notes, like if you're not aiming for a perfect score, you might want to just forget this because it doesn't really matter that much. If you know this one, you're more likely to see like it's surrounding a non-essential clause or like offsetting a list or explanation, not really like just the pause version. So if you're not looking for those super high scores, you probably don't need to know this, but just in case. So for example, it says Heston Blumenthal breaks conventional boundaries. A chef and gastronome, he has gained fame for his experimental approach to cooking that involves molecular gastronomy and unusual flavor combinations. So here we have a chef and gastronome is like there's a pause between like the Heston Blumenthal breaks conventional boundaries, and then like you're pausing to say like, oh, he's a chef and a gastronome, and then you continue your thought after. Again, this is not very common. Like it would be more likely that they phrase it a different way, or like that this would be like maybe a semicolon or something, or a period, and then you would have instead like as a chef and a gastro, like that's more common that they might test like the transitional phrase having a comma after than like what I showed before. So I wouldn't worry too much about this. So yeah, now what I would do is, oh wait, actually I forgot the extra part. Okay, so there's one little extra part where like question marks, you could probably skip the, like, this is like, you could really probably skip, you probably won't see this, where like deciding whether like you should use a question mark or not. So basically if you're asking a question directly, like use a question mark, but if it's part of like a longer sentence, usually with the words like whether or if, then you don't use a question mark. So for instance, we would say like Chris looked at his watch and pondered, should he grab lunch before the event started? So that would be like a direct question. So you would use that. Like a question mark. When I said that, I mean like a question mark. And then you would say, Chris wondered whether he should grab lunch before the event started. So like when it starts with like whether and it's part of a longer sentence, like you're not asking the question directly. So you would use a period, not a question mark. Same thing with like Chris wondered if he should grab lunch before the event started. Same exact thing. You're not asking it directly. It's like within the context of a longer sentence. So you use a period. So yeah. And also like just for your own knowledge, basically like there's like debate, like everything in like grammar is like, even though there's rules and stuff, there's like different people say different things. And like one of the things that like there's points of contention about is like, because like on the SAT they don't really do this, like they say it's like the same thing, but like when you're writing essays a lot of the time, like they say that like there's a difference between using a period, a semicolon, a comma, fanboys, where like a period is more like distinct, like making a distinction between like two separate thoughts, like it's more like it separates them more, versus like a semicolon and like comma, fanboys would be used for like clauses, like when you have two independent clauses that are like closely related to each other. So like when you're talking about two things that could be their own sentence that are closely related to each other, like that's when you would use a semicolon, comma, fanboys. Like most people say in essays, you don't need this for the ACT or SAT, like they're all the same for that purpose. And then they would say like, oh, but if we're talking about like two different things, like they're not really related to each other, then that would be like more appropriate to use a period. So yeah. So now what I would do is I would say go and do all the other punctuation quizzes by yourself, and then go to the video with the punctuation, with me working through the punctuation quizzes if you have any questions or need something explained to you. And that is it.